The mornings came slowly for Frank Dwyer. At 82, he had learned to greet each sunrise not with eagerness, but with a kind of wary reverence. His house, an aging wooden structure on the edge of town, creaked in the chill dawn as though it, too, carried old wounds. The kettle hissed with its thin whistle, filling the kitchen with a pale fog that clung to the window pane. Frank wrapped both hands around the mug of black coffee, steadying his fingers against the tremor that had become his daily companion. Every sip was a reminder of time's erosion. But the greater weight was not age, it was the secret lodged in his chest. Beneath the rib cage, past the scar tissue and muscle, there lay a shard of metal that had once split the air with fire and dust. For 60 years it had remained a silent witness to the war he never spoke of. Doctors had warned him in younger days, but he had refused. To remove it would mean explaining why it was there, and explanations had never been his gift. He would touch the left side of his chest sometimes, and the quiet fingertips grazing the faint ridge of scar like a man tracing a gravestone. The silence around that scar was heavier than the shard itself. No one knew, not even his son. Especially not his son. Mark Dwyer had grown into manhood in the long shadow of his father's silence. To Frank, the boy had always deserved a figure carved from iron, not a father who sometimes woke gasping from nightmares, or one whose heart clenched with guilt whenever fireworks cracked in the July sky. And so Frank built walls, firm, wordless walls. He had taught himself to nod, to offer curt advice, to praise sparingly. He never meant cruelty, only protection. Yet the distance grew like ivy, slow and relentless, until father and son became strangers bound by blood, but not by words. Now, in the twilight of his years, Frank felt his body faltering under the burden of what he carried. Nights brought sweats and stabbing pains sharp as if the metal were twisting inside him. He told himself it was nothing more than old age. He told himself lies because the truth was harder. The body does not forget what the heart refuses to confess. Outside his kitchen window, the world was gentle. Sparrows quarreled on the fence post, and light spilled golden over the withered lawn. Frank tended his garden, slowly pushing a rusted hoe through the soil with deliberate movements. The earth had always been kinder than memory. Plants did not ask questions. They did not hold grudges. They only grew where they were planted, or they withered. But even in the garden, silence followed him. The neighbors saw him as the quiet widower who waved stiffly but never lingered in conversation. Children whispered about the old man with the scar who kept to himself. No one guessed that every step, every breath was negotiated with a fragment of war buried in his chest. Sometimes at night he would take the small box from his dresser drawer. Inside was a folded photograph. 4 young men in uniform leaning against a tank, grinning with the reckless confidence of those who believe themselves indestructible. Frank's eyes always found the face beside him Jimmy Hayes, his closest friend. The memory of that day was sharp as broken glass. A hillside, the scream of artillery the instant when Jimmy shoved him aside and the explosion swallowed everything. When Frank awoke, he was alone, and the shard of metal was inside him, lodged like a judgment. He never told Mark about Jimmy. He never told anyone. The photograph was both a relic and a condemnation. It reminded him of the man he once was and the coward he believed himself to have become. Frank sat often in his armchair by the window, the photograph folded on his lap, the ticking clock filling the room with an unyielding rhythm. Hours passed this way, his breath shallow, his heart laboring. He wondered, though he would not admit it aloud, how much longer the body could harbor both the metal and the guilt. He feared not death, but exposure the moment his son would see the frailty he had hidden, the truth he had buried. On Sundays he attended church, not out of faith, but out of habit. The stained glass bathed the pews in fractured color. He sat alone, listening to hymns that once comforted, but now merely echoed. The words of forgiveness fell heavy on his ears. Forgiveness, he thought, was for other men. In the quiet afterward, as the congregation drifted away, he remained behind. His hand pressed once more to his chest, as though to reassure himself the fragment still lay within. It was a private ritual, a confirmation of penance. The days blurred into one another, yet the weight of silence did not lessen. It thickened. There were moments when he longed to speak, to call his son to confess. But whenever he imagined Mark's voice, he heard only judgment. How could a surgeon respect a man too cowardly to face his own wound? Better to remain silent. Better to let the truth be buried with him. Still, the body betrayed him. One evening, as dusk descended, Frank felt the sharpest pain yet. It spread like fire through his chest, stealing his breath, forcing him to the ground. For long minutes he lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the pain to pass. And when it did, he rose slowly, gripping the furniture, sweat on his brow. He knew then, what he had long denied, the silence would not last forever. Something within was shifting, demanding to be reckoned with. The night was long. He sat in his chair, watching the moon creep across the sky. At some point, he whispered into the emptiness, though no one was there to hear 60 years. "And I still carry you." His voice cracked on the words, the first admission in decades. The scar beneath his shirt throbbed as if answering. The body has its own language. It whispers at first, twinges, fatigue, a quickening of breath, and when ignored, it roars. For Frank Dwyer, the roar came on an ordinary afternoon under the ordinary light of a grocery store's fluorescent bulbs. He had walked the aisles slowly, the basket swinging at his side. Bread, coffee, a can of soup. The world seemed indifferent, moving at its familiar pace. Yet, inside his chest, something stirred, an ache that pressed deeper with each step. He paused by the shelves of fruit, steadying himself on the cool metal of the cart. His vision blurred. The apples in front of him, bright red polished, swam together like drops of blood in water. Then the pain came sharp and unrelenting, as though the shard within him had decided at last to announce its presence. It speared through his ribs, seized his lungs, and dragged him downward. The basket clattered to the floor, cans rolling, apples scattering. Gasps rose around him. The old man on the ground clutching his chest. Someone called for help. A blur of voices, the sound of feet hurrying. But Frank heard little beyond the drum of his failing heart. He closed his eyes, ashamed even in collapse. All his life he had resisted appearing weak, and now here he was, sprawled among strangers, exposed. By the time he woke, the world had changed. A ceiling light glared above him, too white, too close. Machines hummed and measured, rhythm wires trailed across his skin. His chest ached with the memory of the collapse, though the pain had dulled into something more insidious, a knowledge that time had run out on denial. And then he saw the figure at the foot of the bed. A man in his 40s in a white coat with the unmistakable profile of his son. Mark Dwyer. The years of silence between them hung heavier than the oxygen tube at Frank's nose. Father and son stared across the gulf of distance, each unsure whether to step forward or retreat. For Frank, shame eclipsed relief. He had wanted to keep his weakness hidden, but fate had dragged his son into the truth. Mark's voice, when it came, was professional, clipped. "You collapsed due to cardiac stress. They brought you here in time. You're stable for now, but we need to run further tests." The words could have been spoken to any patient. Yet, beneath the clinical tone, there was something else, a fracture in the armor, a trace of anger. Frank swallowed his throat dry. He wanted to say something, anything, but words tangled. How could he begin after decades of silence? He lowered his eyes, pretending to study the lines of his blanket. Mark moved closer, reading the charts, adjusting the monitor. His hands were steady, practiced yet. Frank noticed the tension in his jaw. The son had grown into a man of precision, trained to fix what was broken. But what lay between them was not something a scalpel could mend. The silence stretched. Machines filled it, beeping with indifferent regularity. Finally, Mark spoke again, quieter now. "You've been living with this, haven't you? Longer than anyone should." Frank's lips parted, but no confession emerged. His instinct was to retreat, to preserve what little dignity remained. So he nodded faintly, a gesture heavy with the weight of 60 years. Mark exhaled sharply, a sound between disbelief and frustration. "You should have told me." The accusation stung, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. Yet, Frank could not explain that silence had seemed the only shield against shame. How could he tell his son that the fragment of metal was not just a medical anomaly, but a monument to his guilt? The day that followed blurred into a haze of tests and consultations. Frank drifted in and out of sleep machines tracking his frailty. In the spaces between his mind wandered to the garden at home, the photograph in the drawer, the moments he had left unsaid. Nurses came and went, voices, gentle footsteps, efficient. And always Mark was near, hovering not as a son but as a doctor guarding his patient. Dr. Elena Morales appeared by evening, a colleague of Mark's. She greeted Frank with warmth, her presence carrying an ease that softened the sterile air. She spoke to him not just as a patient, but as a man. Her questions touched gently on his life, his habits, his history. Frank answered cautiously, revealing little, but he noticed the way Mark listened silently. Arms crossed, eyes unreadable. When Elena stepped out, Mark remained. The quiet between them deepened, almost unbearable. Frank stared at the ceiling, feeling the tug of the oxygen line. At last, he murmured, "Didn't want you to see me like this." The words were barely audible, but they cracked something in the silence. Mark looked at him not as a doctor now, but as a son. The expression was complicated anger, sorrow, perhaps even longing, but Frank could not hold the gaze for long. Night fell over the ward. Shadows lengthened across the walls. Frank lay awake, listening to the steady pulse of machines, the distant sounds of footsteps in the corridor. His body felt foreign, a vessel at war with itself. He pressed his hand against his chest, the scar burning beneath his fingers. The shard was there, still a reminder that he had carried too much for too long. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder whether he would survive the days to come. And if he did, what then? Would he die still silent, or would he finally tell his son the truth? The body had betrayed him, but perhaps it had also given him one last chance. The hospital room grew quieter as night pressed against the windows. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, casting a sterile pallor across the bed where Frank lay motionless. Every breath was accompanied by the faint hiss of oxygen, every heartbeat echoed by the steady rhythm of the monitor. Yet, within him, the silence was not calm. It was a battlefield stirring again long after the smoke had cleared. They had told him surgery was inevitable. The fragment in his chest had shifted. The heart could no longer bear its company. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the day after, they would wheel him into the operating theater. He had nodded with weary resignation, but the thought burrowed deep. Not the fear of dying he had made his peace with that years ago, but the fear of what dying might reveal. The truth, raw and unadorned, stripped of silence. As he drifted in half-sleep, memory returned like a blade drawn from its sheath. The year was 1953. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the earth torn open by shellfire. He was young then, 22, with arms strong and eyes untested. The war had a way of making boys into men in a matter of days, but it had also turned men into ghosts before their time. Frank remembered the ridge where it happened, the ground trembling beneath the thunder of artillery. The sound was endless, a storm without sky. Beside him was Jimmy Hayes. Jimmy, with the crooked grin Jimmy who told jokes at the worst moments, who could whistle any tune and make it sound like defiance. They had been brothers forged not by blood, but by fire. Frank could still hear his voice. "Stay low, Frankie. Keep moving." Then the world erupted. A flash, a sound like the tearing of the heavens, and heat that seared bone. Frank recalled the moment he stumbled, the weight of his rifle slipping, the breath punched from his lungs. The blast had thrown them apart. He turned to see Jimmy, struggling, smoke curling around him, and then Frank had always remembered the choice differently. He remembered running, stumbling into cover, leaving Jimmy behind. That memory was the shard in his chest, sharper than the metal itself. It told him night after night that he had lived because he had abandoned his friend. He shifted now, in the hospital bed, sweat forming at his temples. The beeping of the monitor grew erratic as his pulse quickened. Nurses hurried in, adjusting wires, speaking softly, but their words dissolved into the roar of his recollection. In his mind, he was back on the ridge, the ground shaking Jimmy's face smeared with blood. He heard himself cry out, but the sound was swallowed by fire. Then came the pain, the searing stab in his chest as shrapnel found him. He fell, vision blurring the sky, a chaos of smoke and flame. And when he awoke hours later, Jimmy was gone. Only silence remained, and the shard lodged within him. That silence had followed him home across decades into the kitchen where he brewed his coffee, into the church pew where he sat alone, into the distance between himself and his son. Silence had been his only companion because words would have broken him. Now, lying beneath the cold lights of the hospital, he felt the silence crack. What if he did not survive the surgery? What if Mark never knew the truth? The thought twisted within him. Yet to confess would mean admitting not just weakness of body, but weakness of soul. A shadow moved at the doorway. Mark entered quietly, carrying a folder of test results. His coat hung loose, his shoulders taut with exhaustion. He stood for a moment, watching his father's restless form, the sweat on his brow, the twitch of his lips as though he wrestled unseen enemies. Nightmares? Mark asked, though his voice was low, almost reluctant. Frank's eyes flickered open. For a moment he considered answering, but old instincts sealed his mouth. He gave the faintest nod, then turned his gaze away. Mark sighed, setting the folder aside. He pulled a chair closer, but did not sit. The silence between them stretched again, heavy with what neither dared to say. Yet Frank sensed something in his son's presence, concern perhaps, or the shadow of a question long unasked. "Tomorrow," Mark said finally, "we'll operate. We have to." Frank's throat tightened. He wanted to protest, to say that the shard had been part of him too long, that perhaps it should remain until the end. But the words that rose were not defiance. They were memory. Jimmy. The name slipped unbidden from his lips, barely audible. Mark froze. Who? Frank shook his head quickly, closing his eyes. Too late. The name was out the first crack in 6 decades of silence. Mark watched him for a long moment, then turned away, masking whatever emotion stirred within him. Without another word, he left the room, the door whispering shut behind him. Alone again, Frank lay trembling. The monitor steadied slowly, but his mind did not. He saw Jimmy's face again, clear as yesterday, and heard the laughter that had once made the battlefield bearable. He remembered the shove, the explosion, the weightlessness before the ground claimed him. And he remembered waking with the fragment in his chest, convinced it was the price of his survival, the brand of his betrayal. The knife of memory cut deeper than any surgeon's blade could. He closed his eyes and whispered into the sterile dark, "I'm sorry, Jimmy. I've carried you all my life." And the silence answered with the steady, indifferent beep of the machine. Morning came to the hospital like a practiced ritual, polished floors reflecting the first light coffee rising like a dark tide from paper cups, the clatter of carts and the hushed choreography of hands that had learned to move without sound. In the pre-op bay, the air felt newly laundered and overly clean, as if sterility itself were a scent one could wear. Frank Dwyer lay beneath a warmed blanket, his body a pale shoreline where machines came to moor. The rhythmic rise of his chest was measured least one breath at a time by plastic tubing and quiet oxygen. On the rolling table he looked smaller than he had at home, as if silence had kept him upright all those years, and now borrowed by the hospital it had been taken away for sterilization. A nurse tightened a blood pressure cuff, offered a wordless nod, and checked the IV. Frank understood he had reached the edge of a long continent. Beyond the swinging doors, there would be another geography, steel light and precision, a place where a man surrendered his body and hoped to be returned. He had not slept. Night had been a narrow bridge of wakefulness stretched over memories he dared not cross. The name of Jimmy Hayes had slipped into the room and stayed there like a draft under a door. Now, as an orderly touched the side rail and asked him gently, efficiently, if he was comfortable, Frank let his gaze move to the rectangle of ceiling above, as if a sky might be stenciled there. When the doors parted, the operating theater received him not like a sanctuary, but like a bright, indifferent noon. It was colder. Lights gathered overhead in a bouquet of white suns. Instruments lay in neat rows, each nested in blue drape like silver fish on winter ice. Faces appeared over masks, eyes attentive. The room hummed with the intimacy of people whose work was to enter the private chambers of the body. Mark stood near the foot of the table cap, already on hands scrubbed and lifted in the small, almost devotional posture that surgeons assume before the ritual of the gown. The white coat was gone. In its place, sterile armor, a thin fabric between flesh and responsibility. He was all angles and steadiness, the posture of a man who had taught his hands to draw lines inside living tissue and make them mean salvation. Beside him, Dr. Elena Morales glanced once toward Frank, and though only her eyes were visible, a human warmth passed across that small distance like a blanket drawn to a shivering patient. An anesthesiologist murmured metrics, the voice blending with the monitor's metronome. A mask drifted toward Frank's face. A mild plastic smell, the taste of tin at the back of the throat. The last thing he saw was the ceiling light fracturing its halo, breaking into petals. He thought, with an odd calm, that perhaps the heart was a house, and today strangers would enter by the front door. He wondered briefly if the metal inside him dreamed when he slept. Sleep took him in the sound of his own heartbeat being measured by something that did not love him and did not need to. Then, even the measurement fell away. For Mark, the first cut was always a prayer without words. The mind narrowed to a white corridor plan: anticipate, execute. Even the personal, especially the personal, was a fog he could not afford to enter. He noted landmarks on the body with the same remorseless care he gave to Atlas's sternum. Coastal cartilages, the soft, resistant feel of tissue when steel meets it. The bone saw, whined. The air filled with a filament-thin haze. He thought irrelevantly dangerously of the smell of pine on winter mornings when he had been a boy and his father had taught him to sand a board smooth. He put the thought away as if shelving a book. Sternum open, pericardium pale and glistening like a veiled window, the heart beneath it laboring brave indignant. Lines were placed arterial-venous. Perfusion stood ready, hands composed on the machine that would borrow the work of the heart and lungs. Monitors became a choir. Elena's voice met him at each step, a calm readout in human timbre flows, adequate pressures, steady oxygen saturation like a lake holding its shine in a morning light. They cooled the body. They softened time. The heart slowed, then submitted, and in the hush that followed, Mark felt the peculiar awe that always came with this sanctioned stillness. To hold a man's heart quiet in your hands and promise in work and will to return it beating, this was a vow taken in a language beyond speech. The shard had been mapped by imaging, a tiny crescent lodged like a moon behind cloud. Yet, the living field does not obey diagrams. Scar tissue made a gray meadow of the pericardial space, adhesions threaded like ivy. Each movement required a courtesy, each separation a gentle insistence. The fragment lay near a branch of coronary artery intimate with danger. Mark's instruments hovered with the patience of birds awaiting a safe landing. He saw it then, a flicker of dull metal, a gloved fingertip's width from a vessel that brooked no error. It was not clean and sharp as in textbooks, but softened by the body's long embrace, a cruel kindness foreign yet granted residence by decades of muscle learning to beat around it. Elena angled the light. The field brightened until metal showed its true self, a jagged relic, a language of explosion written in a single glyph. Mark's breath shortened not from fear, but from the arrival of a moment he understood would leave a mark inside him. He thought, not now, not here, of the way his father had lived, rigid, silent, a man who believed that love was a roof and roofs were better built without windows. In the glass shield of his visor he saw the reflection of his own eyes and beyond them the small battered cathedral of his father's heart. He began the dissection. Microscope optics rendered the world a planet of blood and light. He teased scar from vessel from adhesion, the solution from the problem with movements so small they were not motions, but decisions. Time lost its clock. He felt only the increments of choice, the quiet mathematics of distance and depth. Then the vessel spasmed. A bright arterial bloom opened with the suddenness of a memory. Suction leapt. The field once serene became weather, wind, and rain in steel and blood. Voices sharpened instrument names like beads on a string. Mark's hands did not quicken. They steadied further. He was the fixed thing in a storm that wanted to move him. Clamp, suture, a needle's arc, a knot whose security he felt in the pads of his fingers. Pressure normalized the red rain resolving into a sheen. The field calmed as if a door had been closed against the gust. He did not look up. He looked only deeper. When his glove finally touched the fragment, it was colder than the body around it, colder even than the room built for sterility. He felt not with his skin, but with a sense that lives in the wrist and the forearm that the shard had edges the years had not forgiven. He spoke for the first time in an hour, the word not instruction, but acknowledgement, naming the thing that had trespassed so long shrapnel. Elena understood. The scrub nurse understood. The room made a space for the word. In one cup of silence, Mark coaxed the metal as one might coax a splinter from the finger of a child who trusts badly. Millimeter by millimeter, the body surrendered what it had guarded. There was, at the last, a tiny give-a-click heard not by the ear, but by the hand. He lifted it free. It lay on the blue field like a tooth from a metal animal. Pitted, dark, asymmetrical. A small thing to have authored so much geography in a life. The scrub nurse dropped it into a stainless basin, and the sound-thin decisive skipped across the room like a flat stone over winter water. For a time, no one spoke. The perfusionist read numbers in a tone that felt like a blanket. Elena's eyes above her mask met Mark's. The look was not congratulations. It was kinship in work. A brief gravity shared by those who had pulled a thorn from the lion that did not know its paw had bled for 60 years. Then the heart needed mending where the metal had made its claim. Mark's hands returned to suture and seal to rebuild the small places where invasion had become residence. He thought of bridges and fences of rooms once locked, now unlatched. He thought against his own rules of a boy who had stood in the doorway of a bedroom where a father sat silent, his back a wall intentionally built. He stitched as if sewing closed not just muscle, but a room that might open. They warmed the body. They invited time back into the room. The heart cooled, and Courteous took its first tentative beats as if testing the floorboards of a house repaired. Then stronger. The monitor's music changed key. Flow shifted from machine to man, borrowed labor returned to its rightful owner. There is a second when a surgeon waits and the body decides whether to accept its life back. In that second, Mark felt the old, undiminished wonder that work and breath could rejoin like two halves of an arch. It accepted. The rhythm steadied. The chest, still open to the world, rose with a modest dignity. He closed, layer by layer, reversing the path of entry until skin drew near skin again, the wound made honest by care. When it was done, when drapes had been peeled back and instruments counted, when perfusion had receded into its quiet corner, and the last suture lay like a final sentence, Mark let himself exhale through the mask. Sweat cooled at the nape of his neck. His arms ached as if he had carried something through a long night. Elena touched his sleeve, a small human pressure in a room that had asked them to be more than human. The shard waited on the side table, a dull star in a tray. Someone would catalog it, doubtless. Someone would log its dimensions and discard it according to protocol. But Mark thought of it as a key he had turned in an ancient door. They wheeled Frank to recovery. The room there was dimmer, nearer to the human scale of lamps and whispers. Nurses arranged wires and lines with the intimacy of people who know how to read a face even when it is without speech. The ventilator breathed for him with an even patience. A warmed blanket covered the pale territory of his shoulders. In the hush that follows a storm, Mark stood at the bedside and let his eyes travel over the man who had taught him by omission and by stubborn presence what standing meant. He did not speak. Words would have been too loud. He looked at the monitor, at the clean geometry of peaks, and felt a steadiness that was not triumph but a clear chord after dissonance. Outside, the day had taken its proper color. It was not victory. Victories belonged to parades and wide streets. This was repair. This was a battlefield where the wounded had been carried from the line and tended in a tent of lights and hands. In the late afternoon, he set the small basin on a side counter in his office. The shard sat inside, no longer lodged in a human story but still radiant with it. He considered throwing it away at once, obeying the rules of disposal. Instead, he wrapped it in gauze and placed it in a temporary box, as if even evidence deserved a period of transition. He wrote a brief note for the chart, concise, impersonal, exact. When he returned to the recovery room, a nurse was smoothing a cooled cloth along Frank's brow. The ventilator's bellows had the sound of a tide that did not tire. The years fell from the air for a moment, and Mark felt the youth of his own longing to be seen by his father not as a man who had surpassed or disappointed him, but simply as a son. The wanting came like a heat, and he did nothing with it. He stood watching, learning again the discipline of waiting, which is the first and last discipline of love. Night would come, as it always came to hospitals, bringing its own regiment of shadows and whispers. In its passage, pain would tap at the edges of anesthesia, and memory would stir to test the seals of sleep. Somewhere between those two visitors, a man who had carried metal inside him for 6 decades would begin the strange, ordinary labor of healing. The first battle was ended. The room knew it, the staff knew it, even the machines seemed to modulate their pitch in acknowledgement. But the body is a faithful historian. It records not only the intrusion, but the reason for it. Beneath the bandages, beneath the sternum, closed with wire, a heart resumed its homework of beating while another ledger, older unwritten, waited to be addressed. In the chair by the bed, Mark sat and let his hands go empty for the first time that day. He felt the ghost weight of instruments, the remembered resistance of metal against steel. When he closed his eyes, he saw not the field, but a hillside. He had never walked where dust rose and a young man with a crooked grin turned his head. A name moved across the back of his mind like a cloud. He opened his eyes before it could gather rain. The ventilator breathed. The monitor wrote its green lines. The hour placed a hand on his shoulder and advised him to stand. He did, finally, and touched the bed rail with the same caution he had used to touch an artery, as if the object might bruise beneath too much certainty. He left the room once briefly to wash his face and pass the metal basin without looking in. When he returned, he paused at the threshold. Some doors require a second entering. He stepped through, sat again, and allowed the stillness to settle on his chest like a book he would have to read soon. There would be dawns to come, conversations to hazard, unsealing to do. The second battle waited beyond the curtain of this recovery, out where language lived, and where the wound that never bled required its own kind of closing. For now, the lights dimmed themselves to a kinder wattage. A nurse adjusted a line with the delicacy of a mother tucking a blanket under a child's chin. A man who had walked for 60 years with a secret lay still, his heart arranging its rhythm like furniture in a room it had just re-entered. And a son who had learned to build strength as if it were silence, listened to the smallest sounds a human body can make and felt, in that listening, the first stitch pull through the fabric of another kind of repair. The first battle was won. The war, which had never been of flesh alone, was waiting. Recovery was not silence. It was a chorus of subtle sounds, the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator, the mechanical drip of fluids, the occasional shuffle of shoes across linoleum. For Frank, however, recovery felt like being stranded between two shores. His body, lightened of the shard that had dwelled in him for 60 years, lay stitched and bound, but his spirit was restless, heavy with the weight of memory. The first battle had been of flesh and steel of hands that coaxed life from the edge of surrender. The second waited in the shadows, a battle not of body, but of truth. When his eyes opened for the first time after surgery, light was fractured, bending around the haze of medication. Shapes resolved slowly, a lamp, a tray, a curtain stirring in the faint draft of recycled air, and then a face familiar, yet stern, leaning close. Mark, the son he had feared to face, now stood in quiet judgment at his bedside. Mark's eyes were no longer the detached gaze of a physician. They carried something sharper, more personal, an ache sharpened into anger. "You said nothing," Mark whispered, though the whisper cut deeper than a shout. "All these years, and I had to find it like this with your chest open beneath my hands." Frank wanted to reply, but the ventilator held the rhythm of his breath hostage. He closed his eyes instead, a silent confession of his inability to speak. But silence, the shield he had used his whole life, had now turned traitor. It only deepened the rift between them. The days that followed blurred in cycles of wakefulness and haze. Nurses tended gently. Dr. Morales checked vitals with soft words that seemed to anchor him to life. Yet, whenever Mark entered, the air changed. It was heavier, crowded with unsaid words. Sometimes he stood at the foot of the bed, arms folded, gaze hard. Other times he left quickly, unable to stay. One evening, when the ward had quieted into the lull of night, Mark remained longer. He sat in the chair by the window, the glow of the monitor painting his face in green. He spoke without looking at his father. "I heard you say a name." "Jimmy." Who was he? Frank's heart stumbled at the sound. The monitor betrayed the rise in rhythm. His mouth, dry and cracked, formed the word without voice. The guilt he had carried swelled inside him, pressing harder than the metal had ever done. Mark turned toward him then, and his voice rose heavy with restrained fury. "You carried this secret your whole life. Did you run from him? Did you leave him there to die while you survived?" The accusation landed with brutal accuracy, striking the very place Frank had guarded for decades. Tears welled in the corners of his eyes, the unspoken answer writ clear on his face. Yes, that was the story he had told himself again and again, that he had lived because he abandoned a friend. Mark shook his head, disgust mixing with sorrow. "I thought you were unbreakable. But now, all I see is a coward who couldn't even tell his own son the truth." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and left the room. The silence afterward was unbearable. Frank lay trembling, heart racing despite the monitor's reassurance. For 60 years he had hidden from that judgment. To hear it aloud in the voice of his son was more piercing than any shrapnel. Hours passed. Perhaps it was another day, perhaps the same night extended endlessly. Time in recovery was a liquid pooling without edges. But then, in the dim corridor light, another figure appeared at his door. Older, heavier, leaning on a cane, but the outline was unmistakable. Jimmy Hayes. For a moment, Frank thought it was another hallucination born of medication and guilt. But when the man stepped closer, the years melted, and the grin, though tempered by time, was still there. "Easy, Frankie," Jimmy said softly, lowering himself into the chair Mark had abandoned. "Don't look like you've seen a ghost." Frank's throat convulsed, words failing him. A tear slipped free, trailing across the wrinkles etched by decades of silence. "I heard you made it this far with a piece of me in you," Jimmy continued, tapping his own chest lightly. "Guess that makes us brothers more than ever." Frank closed his eyes, shame thick as fog. His lips finally parted, a rasp escaping. I ran. I left you." Jimmy chuckled, though there was no mockery in it, only weary affection. "That's not how it went. You didn't run. I shoved you. You wanted to stay, but I wouldn't let you. Someone had to carry the story out of that place. I figured it might as well be you." The words broke through like sunlight after endless storm. Frank's eyes opened wide, disbelieving. "I thought, all these years, I thought I abandoned you." Jimmy's gaze softened. "You carried the wrong memory, friend. You didn't abandon me. You lived because I made sure you did. And all this time you punished yourself for surviving. The relief was devastating. The weight of 6 decades shifted, though not entirely gone. Guilt had grooves worn too deep. But now at last there was another version of the story, one that offered grace instead of condemnation. When Mark returned later, summoned by Elena, he found Jimmy at his father's side. The sight startled him, the man from the photograph he had once glimpsed in a drawer but never heard about. Jimmy stood, greeted him with the ease of a man who had long known his father's silence. "Your old man's tougher than he lets on," Jimmy said to Mark, "but he's been carrying the wrong story. Time he handed it over." Mark's eyes searched his father's face, seeing for the first time not just frailty but the shape of a burden carried too long. His anger faltered, replaced by confusion, then dawning understanding. Frank voice ragged managed only a whisper. I thought I was a coward. All my life." Mark stepped closer slowly, as if approaching an animal long caged. He touched his father's arm tentatively, but enough. "You weren't. You survived, and now I know why." For the first time, the silence between them cracked wide open. Not gone, not mended, but open enough for air, for words, for forgiveness to begin its long labor. The shard that had been taken from Frank's chest now sat in a small glass vial on the counter. Nurses passed it without notice, yet to Frank it was a relic, no longer a curse, but a witness to survival. He gazed at it often, not as a token of shame, but as a reminder of what was given to him by Jimmy by fate, by love disguised as sacrifice. The second battle had begun in accusation and ended in revelation. It was not entirely won. Battles of the spirit rarely are, but the tide had turned. And as Frank drifted into a sleep unburdened for the first time in decades, he heard his son's voice, not angry, not distant, but quiet and near. "Rest, Dad. We'll finish this together." The ventilator sighed. The monitor sang its measured hymn. And in the dim light of the ward, 3 men, father, son, and brother-in-arms, stood bound not by silence anymore, but by truth. The days after revelation carried a different kind of weight, lighter though still unfamiliar. Recovery was slow, every movement measured, but the heaviest burden had already been lifted. For the first time in decades, Frank no longer felt the invisible pressure of guilt pressing harder than the metal in his chest. The wound still ached the body frail, but the spirit was beginning to breathe. Mark visited often, not always as a doctor, but increasingly as a son. He brought newspapers, sometimes sat quietly with a coffee in hand, other times adjusting his father's blanket or reading the chart with gentle insistence. What had once been distance now felt like cautious nearness, as though both were learning a language long forgotten. Jimmy came too, leaning on his cane, his presence grounding Frank in both memory and absolution. They spoke little about the war itself. There was no need. The silence between them no longer condemned it, simply acknowledged what words could not carry. Sometimes Jimmy would pat the glass vial where the shard of metal rested and shake his head. Funny, isn't it, that a piece of steel could hold a man prisoner longer than any enemy ever did? Frank would nod, eyes moist, knowing it was true. The shard had left his chest, but it would never leave his story, and perhaps that was enough. One morning, when autumn sunlight spilled gold across the hospital floor, Mark brought the vial from the office. He placed it gently on the windowsill where light caught the jagged edges. For a long time, father and son simply looked at it side by side. "It doesn't belong inside you anymore," Mark said quietly. "No," Frank agreed. His voice was thin but steady. "But it belongs somewhere." As a reminder, Mark studied him. A reminder of pain. Frank shook his head. Reminder of survival. Of sacrifice. Of grace. In that fragile moment, Mark reached for his father's hand. Their fingers, so similar in shape, closed around each other for the first time in years. The silence between them was not absence, now it was presence. A kind of listening deep and tender. Elena entered, then pausing at the sight. She smiled softly and stepped back, allowing the moment to remain undisturbed. Healing, she knew, was not always written in charts or measured by machines. Sometimes it was simply the sight of 2 hands clasped where once there had been only distance. Weeks later, Frank returned home. The wooden house creaked in recognition as he stepped through the door, leaning on Mark's steady arm. The garden had grown wild in his absence, leaves scattered soil hardening, but the air carried the same gentle quiet he had always sought there. Together, father and son walked the narrow path to the small bench beneath the oak tree. Frank sat carefully, the cool breeze brushing his face. Mark placed the vial on the bench beside him. Sunlight played across the shard within, making it gleam like an unwilling jewel. "This is where it belongs," Frank murmured. "Not in my chest, not in some sterile box. Here, where life still grows." Mark nodded. "Then we'll keep it here, as part of the garden." They buried the vial at the base of the oak beneath roots that had weathered decades of storms. Soil closed over it with finality, the earth accepting what had once been a burden as if it were nothing more than another stone. And for Frank, the act was not burial, but consecration. The shard was no longer a secret. It was history transformed. In the weeks that followed, Frank found himself speaking more than he ever had. Not much, but enough. He told Mark small fragments about Jimmy's jokes about the ridge where the world had erupted, about the silence that followed him home. Each story released into the air felt like a wound sutured at last. Mark listened, sometimes with tears, sometimes with quiet pride. He realized that what he had thought was weakness in his father had always been the weight of unspoken love that had been guarded, armored, hidden beneath silence. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Frank looked at his son and whispered, "You carried me through that operating room, Mark, just as Jimmy once carried me from the battlefield. I see that now." Mark squeezed his father's hand, his voice steady. "And you carried me too, Dad. Even in silence you carried me." The words, simple as they were, completed a circle, long left open. Time, patient, as the seasons moved forward. The scar across Frank's chest remained, but it no longer felt like condemnation. It was a testament, a line of survival carved in flesh. He touched it sometimes, not with shame, but with recognition. Jimmy continued to visit, his laughter echoing through the quiet rooms. The three of them, Frank, Mark, and Jimmy, would sit in the garden watching birds gather at the feeder, talking less of war and more of life that still waited to be lived. One afternoon, Frank turned to his son and said with a faint smile, "If people could hear this story, maybe they'd understand that healing isn't just surgery or medicine. It's truth. It's forgiveness. It's the courage to keep living even when you think you don't deserve to." Mark agreed, and it was then they decided the shard's story should not remain only theirs. It was a story worth telling. And so, as this story finds its end, it carries an invitation. If you have walked this far with Frank and Mark, with Jimmy, and the long silence between them, let it remind you that every wound has a story, and every story has the power to heal. And if you want to continue walking with stories like this of resilience, of survival, of healing, then subscribe to our channel. Each story we share is another shard lifted from silence, another truth set free. The last days of the autumn painted the garden in amber and rust. Frank sat beneath the oak tree, his blanket across his knees, Mark beside him. The air was cool but kind. He looked out at the fading light, felt the steady beat of his heart beneath the scar, and whispered, "I am free." The garden answered in birdsong. The oak's leaves fell gently, covering the earth where a shard of metal now slept. Above it, life continued, roots deepening, branches reaching, seasons turning. It was not triumph. It was something quieter, richer peace. And so we leave Frank Dwyer, not defined by the fragment he carried, but by the love he found in the end. His story is not just his own, it is ours to remember. If this journey moved you, share it. Let it reach others who carry their own hidden battles. And don't forget to subscribe so more stories of healing and courage can find their way to you. Because stories like gardens are meant to grow. As night fell, Mark guided his father inside. Jimmy followed cane tapping rhythm on the wooden porch. The door closed gently, and within light pooled warmly. The house, once filled with silence, now carried the sound of voices, low, steady, human. The sound of healing. And before the scene fades, here is one final reminder. If you believe in the power of resilience, forgiveness, and love's quiet triumph, subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep telling the stories that remind us no wound is too deep to heal, no silence too long to break.